Yeah, thank you for the opportunity for us to come together and learn more about you tonight. I pray that you will speak to each and every one of us with what you want us to learn from tonight. In Jesus' name,
All right, we're going to be three places tonight in the Bible. Mostly Exodus 2, but there are two other places that we're going to jump to in Acts chapter 7. And we did that a couple weeks ago when we started this. We're starting the life of Moses, and actually we started the life of Moses a couple weeks ago. We didn't even talk about Moses. Started before his life, and what was life like before Moses was even born? What kind of world was Moses born into? What kind of circumstances were the children of Israel, the Hebrews, facing? So we're going to be there. Exodus 2, Acts 7. It's really cool. Acts chapter 7 is Stephen actually, just moments before he's stoned to death, is defending the faith. And he's defending the gospel that he's standing for. And part of what he's been made, there's been an accusation made about Moses. So he lays into, let me tell you about Moses. Okay, and so that's why Acts 7 is so crucial. And then Hebrews chapter 11 is the chapter of the hall of fame of those who have lived faithful lives for Christ, and just some different pictures. So we're going to be jumping kind of between those mostly. Tonight we're going to see a clear call to faith even when we can't see God's hand moving. Even when we don't know how God's working, we're going to see how God is at work behind the scenes. That's not a new concept. That's been happening and is still happening today. The circumstances for the Hebrew people are very difficult, as we saw last time, a couple weeks ago. God preserved them, this chosen people of his. He promised Abram that I will make of you a great nation. At that time, Abraham had no kids. He had no children. And God kept his promise. But in the path to doing that, God, first of all, had to preserve that line and protect that line. So he brought them from the land of Canaan, where they were, and brought them to Egypt. He brought them to Egypt just to preserve them, because there's food in Egypt. There's a famine in Canaan. There's actually a famine everywhere, but Egypt has prepared for the famine, and it's the place to go if you want to stay alive, if you want to eat, if you want to have sustenance. Now here we are about 300 years, or a little more than 300 years later, after they originally came there. This people has grown, and they are now a threat to the Egyptian government, to the Egyptian military, to the Egyptian safety and security. And so Pharaoh has made life difficult for them. They are now enslaved, and he's even gone so far as to say, I order you to kill any baby boys born to the Hebrew people. That's kind of a bad circumstance to be in. That's kind of a tough road, tough way to build a nation, tough way to grow your people, tough circumstances to start in. But God is not going to be hindered. That's like for emphasis. The death of all the boys, the baby boys, would not happen. Some of them, I'm sure, did die, but the death of all the boys, the extermination of the nation of Israel, would not happen. The land of Egypt wasn't their home, and God had promised to bring them back to the land He had promised them. And so He's in the process of raising up a man who is going to lead their people, who's going to be the hand of God's deliverance for His people. And so that's where we pick up the life of Moses, because Moses is that man. So first thing we're going to see tonight is, as we look at Exodus chapter 2, the faith of Moses' parents is the first section we're going to look at. And if you look at the beginning of Exodus 2, it says, verse 1, Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a wicker basket and covered it with tar and pitch. Then she hid the child, put the child in it, and set him among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to find out what would happen to him. So you all know the story of Moses, baby Moses being put in the basket. This is that account. Other passages tell us that Moses' parents were named Amram and Jochebed. Okay, so that's their names. They had 2 other kids before this, so they didn't get married, and Moses was their first kid. Their oldest child was a daughter, and her name was Miriam. She was, we don't know exactly, but at the time Moses was born, she was probably somewhere between 7 and 13 or 14, somewhere in that range. So middle school age at the most. Okay, and then Moses had an older brother, 3 years older than him. His name was Aaron. So what we see here is this section really focuses on the actions of Amram, Jochebed, his parents, his mom and dad. And what we see is, their oldest daughter becomes a key component in this account. Their older son, interestingly enough, survived Pharaoh's edict to kill all the baby boys. Somehow he was not one of the ones who died. And so he came through. God had a purpose for him. God had a plan for him. And now they have Moses. And they keep and hide Moses for the first 3 months. If you've ever been around little babies, you can't keep quiet very long. Okay, so that's where this comes in. What do we do with this baby that's going to out us, put everyone at risk, that's going to eventually just get killed? And so, I think I got the verse up on the board to turn back and forth to all these, but Hebrews 11:23. Do I have that? Okay, good. Look at the faith of these parents on display here. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that he was a beautiful child and they were not afraid of the king's edict. So you hear the description of Moses twice here? Anybody catch it? Beautiful. Good thing he wasn't an ugly baby. They would have just chucked him, right? Well, we'll find out a little bit more about that. But this isn't a demonstration. It starts off by faith. Moses is the recipient of his parents' faith. He's the one acted on by the faith of his parents. This is really about the faith of mom and dad. Because Moses at 3 months is not displaying faith here. Moses is going with the flow, going wherever they set him. Okay, he doesn't really have a choice in life. So this account in Hebrews shows us a stark contrast, though. And this is kind of the key to why this whole plan of theirs worked. And that contrast starts off with their faith. By faith, they put Moses. Essentially, we should say, by faith, his parents put Moses in a basket. By faith, they had faith. Because what? What was their faith bigger than? Look at the end of the verse. The fear of the king's edict. Okay, 2 contrasting, competing responses to the events of life. Sometimes we respond in faith. Sometimes we've all responded in fear. Not to say they weren't afraid, but their faith was greater than their fear. Not to say they weren't uptight about what was going on, but their faith overcomes fear. And that's a principle that plays out all through Scripture. We could probably look at a dozen different passages. Or to put it another way, the antidote for fear is faith. The antidote for fear is faith. The cure for your fear in life is faith in Christ. Let me read you a couple other verses. I think I've got these on the screen too. Psalm 34, verse 4. Look at this contrast between faith and fear. I sought the Lord. I put my faith in the Lord. I counted on the Lord. I sought the Lord, and he answered me and delivered me from all my what? Fear. Faith is greater than fear. Look at John 14:27, the words of Jesus. He says, peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. That confidence that we have in Jesus Christ, that faith that we express toward God, that we are counting on him, that we are relying on him. The peace I give to you, not as the world gives, do I give to you, but do not let your heart be troubled. Do not let it be fearful. Peace, that faith that comes with peace, overcomes the fear. Here's what Amram and Jochebed did. Not that they weren't scared in this, but they chose faith. This baby boy born. Okay, they didn't have ultrasound and stuff like that. They didn't know it was going to be a boy until the boy was born. That's how they used to do it. And so she's going through this pregnancy with this dread. Am I going to lose this baby? Is someone going to come along and take him if it's a boy? If it's a girl, no problem. There won't be any issues. But if it's a boy, will I lose the baby? But what was their decision? What was their resolve? I choose faith. I'm going to trust God over having fear. They chose obedience and they were listening to God. And Exodus tells us that Jochebed saw that he was beautiful. And let's put this in a little bit of context. That passage I mentioned in Acts chapter 7, Stephen gives a different context for it. When he's talking in Acts 7 verse 20, it gives us this insight. He was lovely. He was a beautiful baby, but he was lovely in the sight of God. At birth, Moses had God's favor, God's hand on him. Just the calling of God already on his life. And because his parents were godly, because they were people of faith, they sensed this calling on his life. So they were close enough to God to understand this. And so they took action. God has a plan for this, and we're going to take action even if it puts us at risk. Because they have more faith, and they did not fear kings either. They did not fear what man could do to them. They did not fear what people could do to them. They had a higher regard for God. So let's look at the extent of their faith. Let's take this. Okay, so 3-month-old baby, for those of you who aren't familiar with babies, 3-month-old baby can't do anything on their own. You lay them down and they stay put where you put them. They don't go rolling around, they don't go crawling around, they're not doing any of that yet. They don't talk, they just cry and wet their diaper, poop in their pants, want to eat, and that's about the extent of their life, and they take naps. Okay? So that's part of the problem is at 3 months old, babies become a little more vocal. They start crying a little louder. They start babbling a little more. They start interacting. So this 3-month-old baby, tiny little baby, they put him in a basket. They put that basket in the river amongst the reeds, it says. I want you to think about this in context of the extent of the faith of mom and dad. Take their newborn and do it. They left him in the Nile River. What was the king's, Pharaoh's command? Anybody remember? Any baby boys born to the Hebrews are to do what?
Kill them.
Kill them how?
Toss them into the Nile.
Put them in the Nile. Technically, they were obeying the king's command, right? We got it out of a loophole here, okay? There's an existing law on the books that he was to be put to death, and his parents put him there and left him in the care of maybe a middle schooler, to just kind of see what happened. She couldn't really do anything, but she's there to report. That's the extent of their faith. From a human perspective, how good a parenting is this? Okay, they would get chastised. I mean, they would get blasted on social media for doing this, right? What idiot parents would think of doing this? They were the parents that said, we trust God and we feel like this is what God has told us to do.
Plus, in that ancient time, population of crocodiles in that river back then, much higher than it is today. So it was quite
hippos and bull sharks too.
Yeah, so quite a leap of faith doing that.
Yeah, so on many accounts, right? So not only the wildlife, not only the dangers of being in the water, not only that, but there's also a command to all the nation: if you see a Hebrew boy, throw him in the river. Throw him in the river. I'm sure they were afraid. I'm sure. Can you imagine their nervousness when they set that basket there and walked? They had fear. They had their gut was turning. But their faith was greater than their trust in God. The second thing I want to look at tonight is God's faithfulness to protect. God's faithfulness to protect. This story gets nuts here. This is crazy. I love this part of the story. The daughter of Pharaoh. Who should happen along but the daughter of Pharaoh, the highest leader in Egypt, his daughter, came down to bathe where? In the Nile. She came down to the river, and what does she find? With her maidens walking alongside the Nile, she saw the basket among the reeds and came and sent her maid, and they brought it to her. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, God's working in these circumstances right here. God's at work in this moment, in this decision, in this response. She saw the child, and behold, the boy was crying, and she had pity on him and said, this is one of the Hebrew children. She wasn't confused about who this was. She wasn't like, oh, some Egyptian family must have lost their baby in a basket by the river. No, she knew this was one of the Hebrew children. She knew it was a boy. She knew the command was to chuck this kid into the river. Verse 7. Then his sister, Miriam, said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that they may nurse the child for you? Let me see if I can find someone to help you. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go ahead. So the girl went and called, who'd she call? Jochebed. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. I love this. And so the woman took the child and nursed him. The child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses, and said, because I drew him out of the water. So we have Miriam on the sidelines, hiding behind a tree or in the bushes or something like that, seeing what's going on. Maybe 12, maybe 10, something like that. And she sees Pharaoh's daughter come down. Oh, brother. Pharaoh's daughter. If anyone's going to obey the law of the Pharaoh's daughter. This could turn out really disastrous, but God. But God. God was at work behind the scenes in ways that we can't see, in ways that we can't understand. And we see this concept throughout all of Scripture. And many of us have seen this same principle play out in our own lives as we look back on the events in our lives, seasons in our lives. We've gone through difficult times, but we've seen God's provision. We've seen God's protection. We've seen God's hand of guidance. And that's exactly what we're seeing. What should Pharaoh's daughter have done? I found a Hebrew baby boy. I'm going to chuck him into the river, watch him drown. That was what Daddy said to do. But God was in control. She had pity on him. Instead, she commented that, again, she knew this was one of the Hebrew babies, and this is where the story gets really crazy. Because there's no doubt that God's in control of these circumstances. Because Miriam walks up to her and says, "What? You found a baby boy? Whoa. Let me see if I can find one of the Hebrew women to help you with him. Would you like that?" "Yes, please go find one of the Hebrew women who can nurse him and take care of him for me." "Okay, I'll see if I can think of anybody. I'll be back shortly." "Mom!" Isn't that crazy? And so she goes and gets her mom, and Pharaoh's daughter says, "Jochebed, nice to meet you. I'm Pharaoh's daughter. I found this baby boy in the river, and would you be willing to take care of him and help him and feed him and change his diapers and take care of him for me? I'll pay you a fair wage for it." "I think I could swing that. That will fit into my schedule just fine. Thank you." How is God in control or what? Sure is. Isn't that nuts? I love that. Even in times where there's a wicked ruler trying to exterminate God's people, God is still in control. Listen to these verses. Psalm 37. Write these verses down. Psalm 37, 12 through 15. Listen to what the author of this psalm says. It says, "The wicked plot against the righteous and gnashes at him with his teeth." What's God's response to that? So the wicked's plotting against righteous people, those who follow God. What's God's response? Verse 13, "The Lord laughs at him, for he sees his day is coming." Verse 14, "The wicked have drawn the sword and bent their bow to cast down the afflicted and the needy, to slay those who are upright in conduct." The wicked are attacking those who are righteous, those who are following God. What's God's response? "Their sword will enter their own heart, and their bows will be broken." God turns their schemes back on them. And that's exactly what happens here. The plans of Pharaoh turned into foolishness. The king's own daughter rescues this baby that he is trying to kill. Egyptian treasury is paying for this Hebrew mother to care for her own baby. Pharaoh was compelled to provide a room in the royal palace and training and education to this boy who God will one day use to accomplish exactly what Pharaoh is trying to prevent: the freedom of the Hebrew slaves and the defeat of Egypt. God is making it clear that that He is in control, not Pharaoh. All throughout history, this pattern plays out as God's enemies, as the plans of God's enemies backfire. Let me read just 5 short examples here, a couple from the Bible, a couple from history. In 1525, the Bishop of London purchased as many Bibles of Tyndale's New Testament translations as he could for the purpose of keeping them out of the people's hands and destroying them. Tyndale used the money from those sales from the Bishop of London to correct his translation mistakes and print more New Testaments. God took that money and turned it around and multiplied it. A couple biblical examples that you'll remember. From the book of Esther, Haman set out to destroy Mordecai, a righteous Jew, by Persian law. His plan backfired, and he was hung on the gallows and the Persian law enabled he was hung on the gallows that he built for Haman.
I think the word is hanged, not hung. In
Hanged.
execution, I think it's hanged.
You're right, hanged. Thank you, Trey. It is hanged. So he was hanged on the gallows that he built for Haman, or that he built for Mordecai, and the Persian law enabled the Jews to defend themselves. Similar time in history, maybe a little bit before that, the accusers of Daniel. The only thing they could find wrong against Daniel is he would not pray to the government leader. He would not bow down to the idol. He would pray to his God, and so they made a law prohibiting prayer, and Daniel said, I'm going to pray anyways. I don't know if he did those parts, but so the accusers that set out to destroy him by implementing this law were killed by the same lions that did not harm Daniel. Voltaire set out to exterminate the Bible, yet after his death, the German Bible Society purchased and used his home to print and warehouse Bibles. The radio station of Nazi Germany is now used by Transworld Radio to preach the gospel. God at work? Does God turn the schemes of wicked men against them and use them for his glory, for his purpose? And that's what we see happening here. All throughout history, the plans and schemes of wicked men will never stop. Plans of God. God is faithful. We can always choose to live by faith. So God is faithful to protect. Third thing we're going to see tonight in this section, Moses abandons the treasures of Egypt. In verses 11 through 15, let's read those real quick and see where does this go from here. So this is, we see the preservation and the upbringing of Moses in the Egyptian royalty, essentially. Okay? Now it came about in those days that when Moses had grown up, so we jump forward, fast forward, Moses is now grown up, that he went out to his brethren and looked on their hard labors. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. Now this word for beating here, some think this is probably a word that means he was about to kill this guy. He was about to kill this Hebrew guy. So verse 12, he looked this way and that, and then when he saw that there was no one around, okay, that's a good sign you're probably up to something no good. You have to look over your shoulder both ways before you do it. You're probably up to something that you probably shouldn't be doing. Okay, and Moses gets out of God's plan here. He saw no one was around. And he struck down the Egyptian and he hid him in the sand. So if he wasn't dead after Moses beat him, he was dead after he was buried in the sand. Okay, so he killed him. And he went out the next day, and behold, two Hebrews were fighting with each other. And he said to the offender, "Why are you striking your companion?" But he said, "Who made you prince or judge over us? Are you intending to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and said, "Surely the matter has become known."
But I thought he looked and saw no one around.
This is the next day. But the word spread because the Hebrew was there. So when Pharaoh heard of this matter, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from him, from the presence of Pharaoh, and settled in the land of Midian. And we were talking about this weekend. Where did he go?
Oh, wow.
To a well. That's what happens next. In the Bible, whenever anyone goes to a well, what happens? They find a wife. Spoiler. All right. So, yeah, Jesus didn't find a wife. So at this stage of his life, he's about 40 now. Okay, so we just jumped from baby Moses in the basket, 3 months old, to 40. So we've covered the first 40 years of Moses' life already. Okay? And we're going step by step through Moses' life here.
During that time, he was living it up like the Egyptians.
He had everything accessible to him.
Everything.
Yep. He had everything accessible to him. of the Egyptian life, the Egyptian riches, the education, the training, just so much available to them. But at this point, he chooses to turn away from all that. He had it all. He lived in the palace, and he had the unlimited credit cards. You know who I am. You know where I live. That kind of thing. He had the privilege. And he set out to deliver Israel from the hands of Egypt. Hebrews 11, I told you we'd be jumping there. Hebrews 11, verse 24 and 25. We jump ahead. We read about the faith of his parents in the previous verse. Now we read about Moses' faith. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, so this is actually Moses' faith, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God rather than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. We see the evidence of Moses' faith in stepping away from his upbringing, stepping away from what's comfortable, stepping away from the easy life, and stepping into what he knows God has called him to do, and stepping toward obedience to God, to take that that step of leadership that God's put on him. In Acts chapter 7, as Stephen's talking, he gives some other context here for it. He says, Moses was educated in all the learning of the Egyptians, and he was a man of power and words indeed. But when he was approaching the age of 40, it entered his mind to visit his brethren, the sons of Israel. And when he saw one of them being treated unjustly, he defended him and took vengeance for the oppressed by striking down the Egyptian. And he supposed that his brethren understood. Here's his perspective at this moment, at this time in his life. He supposed that his brethren understood that God was granting them deliverance through him. He knew of God's call on his life, and he thought they would understand it as well. But they did not understand. On the following day, he appeared to them as they were fighting together, and he tried to reconcile them in peace, saying, Men, you are brethren, why do you injure one another? But one who was injuring his neighbor pushed him away, saying, Who made you ruler and judge over us? Do you not mean to kill us as you killed the Egyptian yesterday? They didn't understand what God was up to. This past weekend, Brody talked about this at the college retreat. Brody talked about the same concept, the fact that there are times when God puts a call on your life. God calls you to a task, to a direction. Does that always happen? Rarely. God calls, and by the time that plan comes to fruition, some time has passed. Because God's got more that he's working on. God's got more that he's working on than just, let me see how quick I can get you into this role. Let me see how quick I can move this thing along. No, God's going to do it right. He's going to prepare all the things to come together in the right way. We see that at the time of Moses' birth, God had some kind of call on his life. By the time he's 40, he realizes his role is to deliver the people out of Egypt. To deliver God's chosen people out of Egypt. What's the problem? It wasn't God's timing. Yes, that's his job. Yes, that's exactly what God's called him to, but God isn't ready for him to do that yet. He has the right desire, but in this circumstance, he has the wrong timing and the wrong method. Going and beating up an Egyptian guy, burying him in the sand. Not God's will. Moses chose, though, to step out in faith and to follow And he committed himself to doing what God wanted him to do. And God had to bring him back in. You follow me. I don't follow. Moses chose to identify with his people. He knew he was a Hebrew and he willingly left everything. But it wasn't time yet. Why wasn't it time yet? First of all, the people weren't ready. People weren't ready. What was the response of these two guys? Who made you ruler over us? They weren't ready to follow Moses. They weren't ready to look up to him as a leader. They weren't ready to respond to him and go where he led them and hear the call of God, how God spoke through him.
Well, they probably didn't trust him at that point because he was still part of the Egyptian nobility and aristocracy, which were their sworn enemy.
Yep. So there's that, and they didn't trust. They didn't have a reason to trust him yet, so they weren't ready to follow him. Secondly, why the people weren't ready? God was still growing this nation, so it would be an even bigger people that would come to the promised land. It would be an even more numerous people that would populate the land that God had promised them. So the people were not ready yet. But we also learned that Moses wasn't ready yet, was he? Moses, he's taking matters into his own hands. He's not following here. He's like trying to take the bull by the horns and ram things through. Moses was too focused on himself for God. Realize that could be a downfall in your life. You're too focused on yourself for God to use him. God to use you. At this point, Moses, think of where he's at now. At this day, when the two Hebrew men said that, I've turned my back on the Egyptian people, those who raised me in the palace, those who have poured into me. I turned my back on them and left. And I killed one of the Hebrew slave masters, or one of the Egyptian slave masters. But now what happens the next day? He's on the outs with the Egyptians. But now his own people, the Hebrews, are rejecting him. They want nothing. He's a man without a home at this point. He went from the highest place in the kingdom a week ago. He went from the highest point to a man with no home, a man who has no one to accept him. Pharaoh attempts to kill Moses. Moses had to learn that deliverance would come through God's hand, not Moses. So God sends Moses off to school. Obedient school. These few verses that we look at tonight cover the first 40 years of Moses' life. And he was born under the threat of death, but God protected him. And he was raised in the palace with all the education, all the leadership development that the Egyptian treasury could afford. God was preparing him for his call and using Egyptian money to do it. Kind of cool how God does that. It's been 40 years since Amram and Jochebed realized God has something special for our little baby. He's now 40 years old, and Moses realizes God has called me to do something special. Talk about waiting on God. It's going to be another 40 years before God says, taps Moses on the shoulder and says, now, it's time. I'm ready. Got two things for you this week. Some of you have situations in your life that are overwhelming situations that you just can't, it's hard to comprehend what's next. How is this going to play out? I want to encourage you to pray this prayer. God, I don't know what you're doing. I can't see your hand at work, but I trust you with my future decision. This direction that I need to go. This burden I feel that you put on me, God, this big decision, this overwhelming circumstance. I trust you with it. I don't know how you're working, but God, I've seen you work behind the scenes. I've seen you take things and bring them all together at just the right time. So I choose faith. Put that prayer to play in that situation in your life. Second thing, trust God's timing as He fulfills His call on your life. He might want to prepare you for something bigger you even realize. You might need more preparation because God has something else you're just not sensing or aware of yet. Or think of it this way, maybe the people God's calling you to reach aren't ready for you to bring truth. God wants to trust God. Trust God. God, I thank you that your hand is at work in the things and events long before we realize the significance of it. Long before we can see how you're pulling things together, God, you're orchestrating circumstances. Thank you. Praise you, God. Thank you for life of faith, live a life of trust that we can choose to trust you over choosing to respond. God, give us the strength and the determination. Amen.
Hey, everyone, can I get everyone's attention? Be like 5 minutes.